Hi, Andy.
Hi Rahini, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation about living with lockdown.
You're very welcome.
What I would love to do is explore what lockdown has meant for you personally and professionally. But before we go on to that, what I'd love for you to do is actually get you to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so hi everyone. My name's Andy Campbell. I am a life coach for part of my life, and I work in the charity sector for an international development charity for the rest of my life. My career has very much been in the kind of charity or voluntary sector area, I guess. So I've done quite a lot of time as a youth worker, both in individual projects and for larger organizations. And I've run charities, and I've been involved in kind of consulting and helping people in that world think about what they do, why they do, and how they do it. Outside of that, I'm a dad of three daughters and a stepson. Got remarried last year, so that's been an interesting life change, and we're very glad, obviously, at the moment that we did it last summer and weren't planning to do it this summer.
Yes.
And our hearts are with those who have those kind of plans on hold at the moment. Yeah, so at the moment I'm kind of trying to work from home with, there's six of us in the house, including three school-age girls of different kind of expectations of their schoolwork, shall we
Hmm.
say. So it's very interesting, very a good test of the broadband, whether it's working or not. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, that we talked, I did a webinar the other day, we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Mm.
and how Wi-Fi needs to go on there as
Yes.
the core need.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
without,
I mean, that's gone around, hasn't it? There's an image going around for a year or two at least, where yeah, Wi-Fi is the very bottom need, or perhaps chargers before that. Yeah, and that kind of hierarchy. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reflection on Maslow, funnily enough, um, because obviously in the coaching world, we tend to have conversations that are much more at the higher tier of things, the self-actualization thing, and so on. Um, and I'm sure it's the same for you. A lot more basic conversations going on at the moment. People reflecting on where things even fit in that hierarchy. We know it's that it's not necessarily linear, but absolutely there is that thing where the opportunity to reflect on the higher things is arguably never more important than it is now. And we have, some of us at least, have a capacity to do that in a way that we've maybe not had before. But equally, there's a lot of pressure. I mean, I'm sure it's the same for you. I've seen all the Facebook memes with people telling me, now's the time to write that novel, to do this, to do that, to do the other. Um, and I absolutely, I'm having days where I'm lucky if I've got any free time to myself, trying to juggle the kids' schoolwork, feeding them, maybe taking an hour and a half to queue up to get some food, um, trying to fit in kind of life work balance is a lot harder. And I've been really reflecting on how some of the societal inequalities that we always have known are there, but how they're coming through. So really conscious that I'm grumpy that I've got a tiny garden when I know friends who are living on the South Downs, or in a loader space. But also I'm painfully aware of some of my daughter's friends living in 15-story blocks of flats with maybe 5 or 6 people and no shared outdoor space at all. So we're very lucky compared to them. um, but of course the human nature thing is often to look the other way and look at what we haven't got and get grumpy about that.
yeah. I think that's, there's some really interesting points in there. It's all about perspective, but it's at the same time, um, I think, maybe it's a bit of a myth that we have a lot of time on our hands.
Yeah.
We have the same amount of time, but we're filling it in a very different way. So I want you to maybe share with us
Mhm.
how it's affected your family life, because obviously having all the family in
Sure.
home all day long must be a little bit of a challenge.
Well, it is, and we're not instinctively a family who veer towards structure. We're all kind of our personality types. Obviously with six of us there's quite a range there,
Mhm.
but as a group we're kind of a take it as it goes, kind of go with the flow kind of family unit normally. And of course at the moment normal doesn't exist. So the school age girls particularly, that they're actually finding, much to their surprise and to my surprise, um, the kind of the structure of the schoolwork that's been set. Two of them are at secondary school, and so they've got a significantly larger workload than the ones still at primary school. But they're finding that routine quite helpful, as long as we're remembering to adapt and adopt appropriately. So my younger one was getting up, was starting her schoolwork exactly the same time as she would if she was in school, but actually she was probably getting it done in an hour and a half, and that meant she had the whole of the rest of the day free to do whatever she wanted, but with everybody else doing stuff that they couldn't get out of. So for her, we've said, just chill for the first day, go on Roblox, which is her current kind of distraction of choice. Other distractions are available, of course. Just so she kind of eases herself into the day a bit more, so that she's not as disconnected in her timeline as the rest of us. And the adults who are working, we're having to adjust slightly likewise. So where it's possible, we're doing more work earlier in the morning when the girls aren't really up and around, which for me is really hard. I've always been a night owl. My wife is, she's very good at getting up first thing in the morning, and she has her brain working at that point. I've always said I don't really wake up until about 3 in the afternoon normally, but I'm having to change. And also little things like recognizing or trying to recognize and appropriately take opportunities that are presented. So we're allowed out, aren't we, one day, an hour or whatever a day. We don't always take that opportunity, and partly it's mitigated by the fact we have got a garden we can escape to. We can do other forms of exercise, but I've really noticed that if I don't take the opportunity, I miss it. There's a much smaller window for these things. I'm not somebody who's very good historically at kind of going, well, I no longer have an hour commute at the start of the day, I can do something amazingly creative with it. The reality is, as you said, time just squeezes, activities fall into it that are maybe mundane. House has probably never been tidier than it has before, because we're using it for that. But we're starting to kind of make those things, and again, for us, it's about balance. It's about recognizing the pressures both internally and externally to kind of be amazing versions of ourselves during this time, with the reality that actually we're all living under massive stress that we've never had before. We're reacting to it physically and mentally and emotionally in different ways, appropriately, understandably, and that's been really interesting as well. I'm sure you found it with the different ages. We've got a 10-year-old to a 48-year-old in the house, and quite a range between them. And obviously people are dealing with this kind of the whole human race mourning things that we took for granted, mourning the loss of freedom that we took for granted, access to friends, access to other resources. And obviously that's making us physically more tired. It's making us emotionally more kind of thin, I guess is probably a way of putting it. And recognizing that, I'm quite an extreme extrovert. You probably guessed that because I'm just talking and talking. But even I am having to find space to hide and retreat just on my own, which is really surprising for me, because historically when I've tried to do that, like intentionally to better myself, I've failed to do that. I've normally found that my kind of personal growth and reflection best happens with other people. But even I'm finding a need for kind of a little cave to hide in every now and again. So that's really interesting.
That's interesting. Can we maybe explore that a little bit more?
Mm.
So what's caused that to happen? I mean, obviously I understand that you don't have the same opportunities to go out and meet, people and do all the things that we did and
Yeah.
took for granted. Is it the fact that you are constantly with people, even in your little,
Mm.
personal space, which is your home? Is that what it is, or is it something else?
I think that's part of it. I think, even, for example, when you commute, those of us who've commuted, you're with a lot of people, but you're in your own bubble all the time, aren't you? You can put your headphones on, or you can read your book. There's a long-standing joke about the fact that Londoners don't talk to each other on the tube, and the main reason obviously is because it's too flipping loud. But, we don't necessarily interact with each other that way. And so I think for me, it's two or three things combining. One is just always around people. We've got a big enough house that there are hiding spaces, but most of the time we are with, two or three other people all the time when we're awake. Then there's that as the dad of the family, there's consciously and unconsciously, I'm always on duty. I'm always trying to make sure that everybody else is okay, and that their needs are met. And then thirdly, I think it's probably that in reality, I've had those caves. I just haven't noticed that that's what they were. So maybe the commute was that for me. That was a time away from other people, even though I was physically with them. And it's harder to do that in a house than on a tube, because there's, the kids are always going to ask a question about their maths. There's always someone watching telly or listening to something, and you kind of tune into that in a way that you don't when your brain is just left to its own devices. So I think it's that kind of always being on and needing to turn off, which we know, but nonetheless, it's been interesting to kind of notice that.
That's really interesting. And in terms of the structure, I was very impressed to hear how your girls have, literally just fallen into this, structure, and I'm wondering whether you think that is something that they're enjoying because it gives them a little bit more autonomy. Because I think, we all as human beings, we love the fact that we're being trusted to do something.
Yeah.
And that we're given the freedom to do it in the time and space that we feel is best for us.
Yeah.
Is it a case of that, or are your children just unusually diligent?
Oh, no, I think it's definitely the former rather than the latter. I mean, I think the structure has worked because it has been a supporting structure. So if you have the metaphor of it's been the scaffolding around us rather than the building itself, and that's been an important distinction for all of us to remember. We haven't expressed it as that metaphor, but that's how it's worked. So the girls are finding it useful because it's marking out periods of time when they should be doing some schoolwork. We're not on their case particularly. So if they've got maths, so what they're trying to do, mostly the secondary school ones in particular, are when they would under normal circumstances be in a maths lesson, they're trying to do their maths homework now. But what we're also saying is, do you know what, if you need to not do that, that's fine. If you need to go and sit in the garden for an hour or read something or play a mindless video game, if that helps you clear your head, or even just for fun, then that's fine. So that structure's been really useful, but because we're making sure it's not a prison. So I mean, we did even though Easter holidays were coming up a couple of weeks ago, I declared I'd seen somebody else do it online, and I said, right, we've got a teacher training day today. There's no schoolwork. And it was interesting because the youngest one was like, brilliant, that's an hour back of my time, or an hour and a half that I've now got that I wouldn't have had. But what she really meant was actually that's time with my sisters that I wouldn't have had, or I wouldn't have had it in the same way. The older ones were, I kind of almost had to persuade them that it was okay to not work, which isn't my normal experience with them, I have to say. And then the other thing is my eldest is quite an introvert. She loves it. She loves this thing of, she's still having conversations with her friends, but it's completely on her terms now, So those of us who are extrovert, we're kind of clawing up the walls, but the introverts are just, this is bliss, So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. And in terms of the relationships, obviously this enforced, living together all the time, it can either drive people mad or it can deepen the relationship. How has it been for you, and your family?
I mean, I think the reality is it's done both of those things. It's there's definitely been times where everyone or some of the people are a little bit more on edge than they would normally have been. There's definitely been times when patience is thinner and harder to find. But also there's a camaraderie that wasn't particularly there. So my stepson's 21. He's spent most of his life as an only child. He's suddenly got these 3 younger siblings, all girls. It could be a horror story for him, really. But he's brilliant, so that helps. But he's loving it. He's loving, he is now the PE teacher, so he's devising PE lessons for them. We've given him a bit of gardening responsibility, which he's taken to slightly less enthusiastically, but he's still doing it, So he's also been given responsibility that he wouldn't have normally had. So I think that really helps as well. but maybe, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of other people, if not the majority of other people, that because we know that tensions are going to be a little bit stressed, that tempers are going to be a bit flayed, we've been very upfront about that as a family. We've said, if you need space, just take it. You don't even need to say, I'm fed up with a lot of you, I need some time. You just go and retreat to your room, or go and sit in the garden for a bit, and and if people come up to you and you don't want them to bug you, just say, actually, I want some alone time. And that, we don't normally have that permission in the same way. That's not how we've normally operated as a family. That's certainly not how the girls or even the adults would have experienced life. When I've been in a bad mood at work, I haven't had permission to say to people, do you know what, you just need to, like, I'm an angry bear now just coming out of hibernation, you need to give me 5 or 10 minutes. I've had to put on my professional work face and respond as if everything's fine and I'm in control. But because we know we're in extraordinary circumstances, that permission is easier to give and also easier to receive, I think. So I think that's really helped with things.
I love that. It comes back to that whole agreements versus expectations.
Yeah.
And it would be so good if some of these things that we're learning, that we could take them into the new normal, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be such a travesty to go back to the way we were and having learned nothing at all from this experience.
Yeah, and I mean, that new normal thing fascinates me. Again, we've all seen the kind of the question of, when we return to normal, it's going to be worth us asking what normal we want to return to. I'm having lots of conversations with people, both in a coaching capacity and just through my normal networks, who are really, a lot of their identity has been taken away from them at the moment. So I work quite closely with a lot of church leaders, for example. Their whole way of being a church leader has had to change, and most of them are rising to the challenge, and they're learning new things about themselves and the communities that they're responsible for. But it's a seismic shock on their paradigm, on their view of themselves, because if your whole function is to do a particular thing a particular way, and you can't do it that way anymore, you can't do that thing anymore, then there's questions about, well, who am I then? And some people are coping with it worse than others. Some people are really, really struggling with that identity, and they are trying to find time as well, like all of us, to find out what the new normal might become. So how can we hold on to the comparative freedoms that we've been given, even as, or perhaps as a direct result of, other things being taken away from us? From the restrictions that we've got have also given us freedoms. And also which things we're desperate to find again when they'll be available to us again. The human contact, with that first commute, for most people who've hated commuting their whole working life, is going to be a joy and a curse, isn't it? You're going to be, oh, I can't believe it, I'm allowed to sit next to somebody I don't know, I'm allowed to pick up a paper from the train without fear that that it's going to give me something horrible, as well as like, probably for a lot of us, 10 minutes into this crushed tube, we're like, oh yeah, this is why I didn't like commuting. Those two things will happen at the same time, won't they?
Yes. No, that's so true. And in fact, yesterday I was listening to a webinar by Rich Litvin. He had this lady, Vicky Shillington, I think, and she talked about the change theory. And were you on that call? Did you?
No.
Yeah. And she was talking about how there's 3 stages of changes. The first is the chaos, where everyone's like in disbelief and scrambling like mad to try and understand what's going on. And then the next stage is the acceptance, where you realize, oh, where we are. But at this point, you're quite exhausted because you don't know how long this phase is going to go on for. And then it's the new normal. But the interesting thing that came through for me from that whole conversation is that the acceptance stage is where we actually feel quite depleted, because we've spent so much time in that chaos stage trying to resist this disruption, that our energy levels are a little bit lower.
Of course.
Find somehow the energy to be ready for the new normal, because that's when it's all go, go, go. And so I think, these conversations that I'm having with people like you are fascinating, because I want to know what people think the new normal is going to look like. What do you think it's going to look like? Both from your, I suppose, from your personal perspective, but also in terms of what the world's going to look like.
Well, I mean, on one level, I just want to say, who knows, and leave that as the answer, because so many of the things that we've taken for granted are no longer immediately accessible to us, um, and there will be so many changes that then affect other things, so obviously the global economy is going to be wildly different. Unemployment in most countries is going to be significantly higher than it was before. um, the, I think the whole employment structure is going to have to re-examine the kind of gig economy kind of jobs, and the zero contract hour jobs, and the protection that those jobs don't offer people, along with, of course, the occasional freedoms, if people are fortunate enough to be able to take them. So I think that's going to be really, really interesting. I mean, I've seen, I've got quite a lot of friends who are really, really, really creative, and the creative industry is one of the many industries that's really, really taken a hit. People who are artists, who are musicians, poets, authors, these kind of things. Now, those who are able to kind of carve time and space in their perhaps slightly more chaotic home lives, and maybe creating new things of great beauty, but they're not by and large getting paid for it. And I think one of the things that I'm really hoping that we'll see in the new normal is a resurgence of an appreciation for truth and beauty. I mean, already, our social media is beautifully littered with pictures of ducks and grass, and scenes from people's daily exercise. And I'm seeing time and time again, I'm seeing people saying comments like, I've taken this for granted. One of my friends posted a picture from his walk on LinkedIn earlier, and the caption was, "This has been right outside my door. I've never done it before." And this kind of thing. Now, that's going to be one of those things that's going to be really hard for us to hold on to. I think we're going to have to intentionally hold on to that, because, as you know, the pressure to return to the old normal will be huge. Because there's safety in that, there's a knowingness and a knowedness in there that's really, really important. But we won't return to the old normal. We can't. It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. There will be echoes of it. There will be parts of it that we can adapt, parts of it that we can readopt, but it will not be the same again. One of the big things for a lot of people working, people who are still in work but working from home, we're all having the same conversation, aren't we? We're all saying, why did I need to commute? Why did I need to go into an office? What was the real advantage of it? How much of that was actually to do about being controlled? That our employers can see us. They know that we're working, and employers have had to wrestle with that. Employers have had to wrestle with, do we trust our workforce? How can we show them that we trust them? How can we empower them to do the jobs that they've always been doing in a new context? But at the same time, that valuing and that re-examining of how we do community, both in our localities, in our streets, in our social groups, whatever they are, in our family groups, but also as a workforce. How do you connect people together meaningfully who aren't physically in the same place for all or most of the time? And so we've seen a resurgence of, I'm sure this is true of people that and maybe yourself, that so many informally organized coffee chats,
Yeah.
which is, it's like, let's have an impromptu thing exactly at 8 o'clock. This kind of free expression that is actually quite controlled and structured, which is an interesting, really interesting thing going on there. But they've been really interesting because we know the importance of inane banter. We know the importance of chit chat. Even though we can't measure it, even though we can't prove that it's making us, perform better, we know that actually it's good for our souls, it's good for our minds, and it forms and sustains those relationships with people.
Yes.
So I think that all that stuff is going to be different. I'm not quite sure how it's going to be different. I'm not quite sure what level of slippage there's going to be back to the old way of doing normal. And as I said, some of that slippage will be because, completely understandably, we are all going to be under huge pressure from ourselves, at least, for safety, for familiarity, But I think it's quite exciting. It's quite an exciting time. I think the big thing for me, unashamedly with the coaching hat on, and I know a lot of coaches are wrestling with this one at the moment, is, that there has never been a more important time to stop and think about things. Because when we do return to whatever normal is going to look like, we will slip into doing it that way. It might be that we slip into how we've always done things, or it might be that things have changed, but we're creatures of habit, so we're going to get back into a routine. And unless we intentionally create that kind of headspace, that reflective space, we're just going to get into a new rut, a new way of doing things. That is just how we do things.
Yes.
But of course, there's this wide range of realities for people at the moment. There's people who are on their own, who have got nothing but free time. People have been furloughed, people with no obvious responsibilities for other people, or at least who have responsibilities for other people, but they can't physically be with them, who've suddenly got more free time than they're used to, and that can be quite paralyzing. That can feel quite stressful. There's lots and lots of pressure to learn new things, to better things, as I say, to write that novel, all those kind of things. But at the same time, there's those of us who have, it feels like anyway, less time than ever before to do things, because we are managing more things. We're responsible for more people. So as I said, back to my situation, the only way I've been able to carve any reflective time is to deliberately say to everyone else in the family, right, I'm going to the bedroom, I'm in a meeting, or I need to not be disturbed for an hour, which is really counterintuitive for me. That's not how I've normally done things. But that is the only time. Otherwise, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to do stuff, be responsible for people, be responsible for me, get the minimum of the things done, and I'm going to go to bed exhausted.
Yeah.
And because I, like everybody else, am in mourning, I am physically more tired. So I'm finding it's hard to get up in the morning. It's harder to stay awake later in the evening than ever before. So I think that stuff's going to be really, really interesting. Taking those church leaders that I mentioned earlier, the nanosecond things return to normal, they're going to get back into a way of doing things. The executives are going to be doing the same thing. The people in business are going to be doing the same thing. We need to somehow find space where we can go, what things don't I want to return? What things do I need to return, but in a different way? And what are the essentials that I must get back, and do it, broadly speaking, the same way? And how do I make sure that those things happen? Those questions are really, really important at the moment. But the pressure on everybody to do them is huge. But the reality of creating time and space to have that thought process is also quite tricky.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation that, whether you're a leader of your business or you're an employee, I think this is a great time to have a conversation, a bit like you have with your family, that you all realize you're in it together, and that you are being present for one another because you're forced to be present, and either you could be present or you could not, be there for one another. And it makes it easier to then respect boundaries. Create those spaces, and I don't see why we couldn't do that in our working life. So let's talk a little bit about your professional work. You got your two separate hats, obviously, which is your own business, but also the charity work you do. So which is the one you feel that you're more ready with a view on how you're going to adapt to the new normal of those two?
Well, I think probably the coaching side is easy. I mean, I'm still kind of in the early days of my coaching as a career, although like a lot of us who are in the coaching world, my reflection is that actually I've been operating coach-like models, at least for most of my career, with people. The charity I work is much more, it's much more task orientated at the moment. There's a job to be done. There's some nuance about how that job can be done, but in reality, I don't have too much control or influence about that, so I just kind of get on with it. Although where I'm able to, I'm able to have those conversations with those around me, those I'm responsible for, those I'm responsible to say, is this the best way of doing things? Is what we're trying to do going to achieve what it did before under the old normal in this time of transition? So it's really, so sociologists and theologians have this term called liminality, which is just the time of between the old and the new, when the old has gone but the new has not yet come.
What is it? Liminality.
Liminality.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so it's a way, and it's best explored in community. It's best explored now. I like that because I'm a process thinker. My best ideas are always through conversations with other people. But just this idea that we're on a shared journey. So a story I can tell you to illustrate liminality is from the Jewish history, the Chronicles, when they left Egypt, where they were captives, and they moved across the desert to whatever this thing was called, the Promised Land. And it took them a lot longer than they were expecting it to. And the narrative is there if you want to read it in the Old Testament of all the things they went through. Now, regardless of any kind of faith view or not that you might hold, it's an interesting story because they had a whole generation where the old had gone, but the new had not yet come. And so that kind of halfway, excuse me, that halfway place became their reality. It became the now, but not the lived. It became the lived reality, but not the expected reality. They knew that it wasn't where they were going to be forever. So I think there's huge parallels between that story and where we are now, because the old normal has gone, and because, as you said, we don't know how long. This is the wilderness years for us. We don't know how long we're going to be in lockdown. We don't know when lockdown is lifted what kind of freedom of movement is going to be given back to us in the short to medium term, and we certainly don't know where the promised land is. We don't know what this new reality is, and why it's best experienced in community is because we often, and again as coaches we know this, that often we need someone or a group of people around us who could say to us, have you noticed what is happening? Have you noticed how you're changing? Have you noticed the assumptions that you're making? And we likewise need to be people who are doing that with others. So we need to be someone who's saying to our friends, to our neighbours, to our colleagues, to those that we work for or those we work with, have you noticed what's going on? Have you noticed that you are trying to fix the new problem using the old tools? So one of the fascinating things about those wilderness years for that generation of Jews was that there was a bunch of them who were apparently going to Moses, it would have been better if we'd still been slaves. We had a roof over our heads, we had food guaranteed, and of course the roof over their heads was only because they were being kept as slaves. They didn't have a great life. When they were there, all they could think about was escaping and not being captive anymore. But once they were free, the only thing they could think about was the old reality. And that tension is there for us right now, isn't it? All of the things that we're missing, that me talking earlier about, I miss commuting. I don't miss commuting at all. I've been very fortunate in my life. I haven't had to commute for most of my career. I've spent the last 3 years going into central London, 3 or 4 times a week, and hating it, always being exhausted by it. But there's a part of me that thinks I'm missing it because it was a routine, because it was what I did, between 7:30 and 8:30 of the morning or what have you.
Because you could do it when you wanted to, and I think that's what most of us miss. The ability to just choose. And
yes.
Yeah.
To really have the option to choose, or at least to have the illusion of choice.
Yes.
Because obviously sometimes some of the things that we think we're choosing, we're not really. But now even that illusion of choice has gone away, hasn't it? I live quite near a big supermarket. With 6 of us in the house, it was important every night. We'd invariably run out of something. You could just pop to the supermarket, pop in, pop out. You'd be gone like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Whereas now, if I go to the shops, I've got an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, because I might be queuing for an hour to get in.
Yeah.
And then that limits the choices that I've got around that. When do I do that? If I try and do that during the day, I'm taking a 2-hour lunch break, which isn't relaxing because it's shopping. It's not quite the same.
True, I agree. So how are you, as a family, how are you kind of turning this, what could be quite a grim and negative situation, especially if you watch the news, it feels unrelentingly bad.
Yeah.
How do you make light of it, or not make light, because it is a very serious situation, but how do you not dwell on all the negativity as a family?
Sure. Well, I think, one thing I would say is we don't watch the news very often. We really, really trying to temper that. Um, uh, and I've had moments when I felt quite anxious about my family's well-being, where maybe my wife has wanted to watch the news and I've said, you can, but I'm going to go to a different room because I don't need to hear. And it's not wholly putting my head in the sand. It's about managing that stress and that anxiety and just saying, hearing a confirmation of my worst fears is not going to help me at the moment. So I need to not hear it. I'm not pretending it's not there, but I just need to not have that reinforced. So that's one thing. I mean, it's been interesting again with young children in the house. Definitely a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 15-year-old were processing the reality of what was going on very differently and at very different speeds, completely understandably. And so they had peaks at different times when they were really anxious, and they had peaks at different times when they were more pragmatic about it. So one of the ways of managing it is to not overload the bad news. One of the ways to manage it is to give, again, it's that permission thing again. It's giving everyone permission to feel as good or as bad about the situation as they currently do, and not having to pretend that they're coping better or worse than each other. And then the other thing is actually, I think we do make light of it. I think there's a really healthy healing quality of like a battleground humor that that arguably the British have been specialists for generations, but that really kind of dark humor. And I was chatting to a friend of mine who's an NHS doctor, and that's the reality in the wards. That's the reality in the operating theatres, because if you can't find something to laugh about, then the seriousness of the situation weighs you down completely. And it doesn't mean you're taking it lightly. It doesn't mean you're inappropriately, taking anyone else's situation lightly, but you do find ways and places to laugh about it. And then the last thing is to just deliberately find times to celebrate who you are and who the people around you are. So I bought a fire pit last year. We hadn't got around to using it because, like everything I've ever bought in my life, it went somewhere and I forgot about it. So we've been doing that, not every night, but we've just gone out as a family, and we watched a film outside the other week. The girls have been roasting inappropriately sized marshmallows on the fire, and just we've been having bits where we're being silly and singing or dancing or just playing the fool, and making a point of enjoyment. Making a point. Two of my girls have got their birthdays coming up in the next week and a half, 2 weeks, and that's going to be interesting. How do we celebrate things that we must still celebrate, but how do we celebrate them appropriately when they can't have their friends around with them to celebrate it in the way that they used to? Yeah, sure, we'll probably have a Zoom party and it will meet some of those needs, but it won't meet all of them. So we'll just have to make sure that they are, I don't buy into this kind of way of doing things normally, but my girls are going to feel like princesses those 2 days. They're going to feel like they are the most special people in the world to me, because they are, but they're going to feel that on their birthday, because whether they can articulate it or not, whether they're aware of it or not, they are going to be very, very aware that this isn't normal. It isn't the old normal, and it's not whatever the new normal is going to be. It is what it is. But we mustn't let the reality of lockdown define their birthday, their happy day. That we must find ways of celebrating each other. So yeah.
I love that. I think that's beautiful. And just finally, I want to ask you how are you finding the conversations with clients? Because this is a really, it's an anxious time for a lot of people. Yeah. And coaching is something that obviously there's different kinds of coaching, but very often people don't see coaching as a necessity. They will often see it as a luxury or or a remedial thing. They'll only come when they actually have a real need, rather than because they want to invest in themselves.
Yeah.
What's been your experience, especially since this whole virus thing has hit?
Well, I think a lot of my coaching pre gestures wildly all this often centered on anxiety management on some level anyway. So often people came to me for coaching who wanted some kind of change in their life. They may or may not have known what that was. It may have been a personal or professional thing, but often at the root of that was a form of anxiety, not clinical anxiety, not necessarily a lived or realized anxiety, but some kind of level of worry or fear of cautiousness, or all the things that as coaches we're always talking to our clients about what is it that's stopping you making this decision? What is it that's stopping you taking the next step? What is it about you that you're worried you'll lose if you do this? And trying to turn those things on their head. So on some level, the coaching conversations haven't changed much. The style of those conversations hasn't changed much. The topics have been different. That certainly the entry topics have been different. The presented issue has often been a much more pragmatic decision about day-to-day life, job insecurity. All those kind of things are definitely there in spades at the moment. But the when you drill down, the core of the discussion is still, who am I? Who do I want to be? Which part of myself do I want to improve or stop or change? Which part of myself do I want to celebrate and grow in different ways? Which part of myself is, to use Americanisms, unrealized at the moment that I want to kind of realize in some way? So I think the other thing that's really interesting as a coach at the moment is coming back to that thing of, I think there's never been a more important time for people to find space with themselves to reflect on their reality and how they want it to manifest. And of course, coaches are one, we would argue, really useful way of doing that, but there are others as well. But absolutely, I'm finding people more cautious to kind of come over that line. So I'm still having some conversations, as we all are, with our kind of introduction sessions with people, but getting people to go, actually, I need to invest in this, with all the other pressures that they're much more conscious of at the moment around them. I'm finding harder. That may be something to do about my sales technique. I've never really pushed the sales to sales stuff. But even interestingly, I've, like a lot of other coaches, I'm offering more free or reduced sessions to people. I've offered free sessions to NHS workers, to teachers, and to clergy, church leaders, and so on. People who are under new, unexpected pressures. And some people have taken me up on them. But even those conversations haven't always converted into a coaching conversation because of the other pressures that they feel. So even when I'm saying to people, I can give you an hour where with yourself, where all I'm going to do is help you notice what's going on, even that has been much harder than under normal circumstances for people to commit to, which I find really interesting. So I'm sure it says quite a lot about me as well, but I find that really, really interesting. And for me, that also comes from fear on some level. It comes from this kind of idea that if I start to reassess things, I will have to change. And there's already so much change going on around me, including all these unknowns that we've talked about. Can I afford to put another ingredient of change into that mix, into that bubbling pot? And I understand that. I understand why people are cautious about that. But obviously, as a coach, I want to say, if you're listening to this and that's you, then talk to me or talk to Rahini or talk to somebody else, because if you can mitigate, if you have control over that part, then actually you'll find a lot of the other parts you'll start to have more control or influence over. And you'll also recognize, because this is what coaches do when we do it really well, you'll also be able to absolutely go, that whole thing over there, nothing I can do will change that. Do you know what? That's going to be lovely. I can put that down, or I can put the worry of that being in part of my reality down.
Yeah.
So I think it's really, really important, but I think people need to understand that and need to not be fearful of investing in themselves in that way.
I love that. And I think it's someone I saw on Facebook, someone put out that if you can't go outside, go inside, go within.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually there's so much to be said about, just literally taking some time to think, what are the things I can control? Because there's so much in the world that's not in my control.
Yeah.
And what is the point me worrying about that? And just focus on the things that I can control. And the one thing that we all can control is ourselves.
Yes.
Our responses to things. And I think, I'm completely with you on that if you can just take some time to, stop and reflect and reconsider, how have I lived my life? What's a priority for me today? And how do I want to be ready so that, whenever this new normal comes, I'm in the best shape I can be, so I can really seize it. I think that makes so much sense. And hopefully people will take it up,
Yeah.
It will be scary. It will probably require sort of an investment mindset rather than, oh, can I afford to spend this?
Yeah.
But people who do it, it will be worth it. So It's been a fascinating conversation, Andy.
Likewise, Rainey.
Would you want to sort of leave our viewers with any kind of final thoughts or message or insight from this particular living with lockdown period?
I think all I would say is, if you're listening to this, that it's okay. Whatever you're feeling is okay at the moment. Whether you're feeling in control and you're looking at all the people around you who look like they're not, and you're starting to judge them maybe, or you're starting to worry that maybe you're just kidding yourself, that's okay. If you're living in real fear, that is still okay. And the reason that that's okay is that it will pass. It will change. Part of the new normal is that you won't be living in the same fear. And there's a plethora of coaches and other people out there at the moment who are looking out for opportunities to work with you. There's a load of people who are offering free or reduced courses or access. There's loads. So if finance is the thing that's stopping you, stop using that as an excuse and find someone who can offer it for you for free. But of course, we know that sometimes financial investment is the really important thing. We know that there's something about how much you put in means it helps how much you take out. So don't let finance be the reason that you don't do it, whether it's because you can't afford it or because you don't think you can justify it. And whether you use a coach or not, whether you use someone like Rohini or myself or not, look for those opportunities to take time to be with yourself. Look for them. They will exist. Even those of you who are listening to this and who are really, really connecting with my story of, I have never been busy. I've never had more responsibility. It's been really hard for me to carve time out. And absolutely, there's been times when I've failed to do that. But even if that's your story, you know that you can find a way of talking or thinking about it with yourself. It's going for a walk, it's having a chat with a mate, it's having a virtual pint with someone, whatever it is. And we would say that coach is a good part of that mix. But whatever it is, stop making excuses to not look after yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup. If you're that person and you're busy because you've got more responsibilities for other people than ever before, then this is the most important time for you to look after yourself so that you can look after those other people properly.
I love that. So self-care, and the older analogy of the oxygen mask analogy on a plane.
Yeah.
It's metaphorically it also fits with what the virus we're facing. But yeah, I completely agree. Thank you, Andy. It's been
Rohini, bless you.
Thank you for joining me today, and I wish you all the best. And I love your family. I love the dynamic you managed to create, and I'm sure you're going to be a real inspiration to lots of other people who may be
bless you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Rohini.
Thank you.